I'm Lieutenant Colonel Judy Williams, 32, and I built my career in the force from the ground up through discipline, sacrifice, and service. For years, I sent money home, covered for my sister Erica, and put my family first, even when it meant putting myself last. But the night before my deployment, I overheard them laughing in the kitchen about a secret life insurance policy they'd taken out on me, betting I wouldn't come back alive. That was the moment everything changed. Have you ever been betrayed by the very people you thought you could trust? If so, share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I dive into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about setting boundaries and reclaiming your worth. What came next might surprise you. Looking back, I should have seen it coming. The signs were there, scattered like breadcrumbs through months of family dinners and weekend visits home. My sister Erica had always been the one who got away with everything, but lately her comments carried a sharper edge. When I'd show up in uniform for Sunday dinner, she'd roll her eyes and mutter something about playing soldier. When I mentioned a promotion or a commendation, she'd shrug and change the subject to her latest drama at the boutique where she worked part-time. "Must be nice having the government pay for everything," she said once, picking at her salad while I described the leadership course I'd been selected for. "Some of us actually have to earn our money." Mom had laughed it off. "Erica, don't tease your sister." But there was something in the way she said it, like she was humoring a child rather than correcting her. Dad just kept eating, his silence feeling more loaded than supportive. The financial questions started subtly. Erica would ask things like, "So what happens if you get injured over there? Do they compensate your family? Or I heard military wives get death benefits. What about sisters?" She'd frame it as curiosity, genuine concern for my well-being, but something about the timing felt off. These conversations always happened when our parents were within earshot, and I'd catch them exchanging glances I couldn't quite read. At Thanksgiving, I noticed how conversations would pause when I walked into a room. Not stop completely, just shift gears so abruptly it was obvious they'd been talking about me. When I'd ask what they were discussing, I'd get vague answers about work or family friends I barely knew. The secrecy felt deliberate, calculated in a way that made my chest tight. "We were just talking about the Hendersons' new house," Mom would say, but her eyes wouldn't quite meet mine. Erica would nod along, suddenly fascinated by her phone screen. The pattern became clearer during my last few visits home. My parents, who had always been careful with money, seemed more relaxed about expenses. Dad mentioned looking at new cars, and Mom had started talking about renovating the kitchen. When I asked where the money was coming from, they'd get vague about some investments paying off or a little windfall. Meanwhile, Erica had started asking more pointed questions about deployment risks. "How dangerous is it really where you're going?" she'd ask over coffee. I mean, statistically speaking. When I'd try to reassure her that most service members come home safe, she'd press for numbers, percentages, specific scenarios that could go wrong. "Well, at least if you don't come back, something good might come out of it," she said one afternoon, then quickly added, like, "you'd be remembered as a hero." That's something, right? The words hit me wrong, but I forced a laugh. "Thanks for the vote of confidence." "You know what I mean," she said, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. During that same visit, I overheard my parents whispering in the kitchen while Erica and I watched TV in the living room. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was conspiratorial, excited in a way that felt inappropriate given I was deploying in 2 weeks. When I walked in to get water, they stopped talking so abruptly that Dad knocked over his coffee mug. "Just discussing Christmas plans," Mom said, cleaning up the spill with unnecessary urgency. But Christmas was months away, and I wouldn't be home for it anyway. They knew that. The final dinner before my deployment was strained in ways I couldn't articulate. Erica kept steering the conversation toward my deployment, asking questions that felt less like concern and more like inventory. "So you've updated all your paperwork? Emergency contacts, beneficiaries, all that stuff." She'd nod thoughtfully at my answers, like she was filing away information. Mom had made my favorite meal, but the gesture felt performative rather than loving. She kept asking if I needed anything, if there was anything they could do for me, with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to the situation. Dad was quieter than usual, drinking more wine than normal and avoiding eye contact. "We're so proud of you," he said toward the end of the evening, but it came out stilted, like he was reading from a script. Erica had hugged me goodbye that night with what felt like relief rather than sadness. "Be safe out there," she whispered, and for a moment I thought I felt genuine emotion in her voice. But when she pulled back, there was something calculating in her expression that made me uneasy. Driving home that night, I tried to shake off the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. These were the people who had raised me, who had celebrated my achievements and supported my decision to enlist. Erica was my sister, despite her sarcasm and occasional selfishness. My parents were good people who had worked hard to provide for their family. But the questions lingered. Why the sudden interest in military benefits and death compensation? Why the secretive conversations and evasive answers? Why did everyone seem more focused on the risks of my deployment than the mission itself? I told myself I was being paranoid, that the stress of deployment was making me read too much into normal family dynamics. Erica had always been a little jealous of the attention my military service brought me. My parents had always worried about my safety. These were natural reactions to having a daughter and sister heading into a combat zone. Still, something felt off in a way I couldn't name. The pieces didn't quite fit together, like a puzzle with corners that had been forced into place. The financial questions, the secretive conversations, the way they seemed more interested in worst-case scenarios than in my actual mission or well-being. I pushed the thoughts away as I packed my gear and prepared for deployment. I had bigger things to worry about than family drama. But deep down, a small voice kept whispering that the people I trusted most in the world were hiding something from me. Something that would change everything if I knew what it was. The night before I left, I told myself I'd call them more often from overseas. That distance would help us reconnect. I had no idea how wrong I was. 24 hours later, I packed my duffel bag for the final time and headed to my parents' house to say goodbye. I walked through their front door planning to leave with hugs and promises to stay in touch. Instead, I left with the knowledge that would reshape every relationship in my life. The walk to their kitchen felt routine, familiar. What I heard there would haunt me for months. I should have trusted my instincts about those warning signs. But sometimes the people closest to us are the ones we're least prepared to see clearly. The house was quiet when I let myself in with my spare key. I'd called ahead to let them know I was coming, but no one answered the door when I knocked. The living room was empty, but I could hear voices coming from the kitchen, low and familiar. Mom, Dad, and Erica's laugh drifting down the hallway. I walked softly toward the sound, planning to surprise them, maybe catch the tail end of whatever story was making Erica giggle. The hardwood floors in the hallway had always creaked, but I'd learned to avoid the noisy spots during my teenage years when I'd sneak in past curfew. Old habits. As I got closer, Erica's voice became clearer. "It's perfect. The policy pays out double if it's combat-related." She was still laughing, but there was something sharp in it now, something that made me stop walking. "How much again?" That was Dad's voice, curious in a way that made my stomach clench. 200,000 base, 400 if she dies in combat. Erica's tone was matter-of-fact, like she was discussing grocery prices. And the beauty is, she has no idea we took it out. The military keeps such detailed records that we could forge her signature on anything. I pressed my back against the hallway wall, my heart hammering so hard I was sure they'd hear it. This had to be some kind of misunderstanding. They couldn't be talking about me. About life insurance. About hoping I'd die. "When did you say the policy went active?" Mom's voice now, businesslike and focused. "Last month." Perfect timing with her deployment. Erica sounded pleased with herself. I used her social security number and forged the medical forms. She's so trusting, she never checks her credit report. And they don't investigate beneficiaries? Dad again, practical concerns threading through his voice. Not unless there's obvious foul play. Combat deaths are clean, expected. No one questions family collecting on military life insurance. Erica's laugh had turned cold. Besides, she's stubborn enough that she'll probably get herself killed trying to be a hero. The world tilted. I gripped the wall to stay upright, my legs suddenly unsteady beneath me. These were my parents, my sister, the people who had raised me and claimed to love me. And they were casually discussing profiting from my death. She's always been reckless, Mom said, and I could hear her nodding. Remember when she insisted on that advanced training course? Or when she volunteered for the more dangerous assignments? She thinks she's invincible. She's too stubborn to ever leave the service alive, Dad added, his voice carrying a certainty that cut through me like ice. At least this way it won't be for nothing. For nothing. The words echoed in my head. My service, my sacrifice, my willingness to put my life on the line for my country, all of it meaningless to them unless it resulted in a payout. What if she finds out? Mom's voice carried a note of concern, but it wasn't concern for my feelings or our relationship. It was fear of getting caught. She won't, Erica said confidently. She's too focused on playing soldier to pay attention to anything else. And even if she did, what's she going to do? Cancel a policy that benefits her family? She's too noble for that. They laughed together, a sound that should have been warm and familiar, but now felt like nails on a chalkboard. They knew me well enough to manipulate me, to use my own character against me. They'd counted on my loyalty, my love for them, to keep me blind to their betrayal. I still can't believe it was this easy, Erica continued. She sends money home every month, she calls every week to check on us, and she never questions anything we tell her. She's the perfect mark. Don't call your sister a mark, Mom said, but there was amusement in her voice rather than genuine reproach. What else would you call someone who funds their own life insurance policy without knowing it exists? Erica shot back. Someone who's so desperate for family approval that she'd die for people who are literally betting on her death? The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. They weren't just hoping I'd die for the money. They were mocking me for loving them, for trusting them, for being the kind of person who'd sacrifice for family without question. I heard chairs scraping against the kitchen floor, the sound of them moving around. Should we tell her we're proud of her again? Dad asked. Really lay it on thick for the goodbye? Absolutely, Erica replied. The more emotional she gets, the more reckless she'll be overseas. Win-win. I'd heard enough. More than enough. My legs felt like they were moving through water as I backed away from the kitchen, careful to avoid the creaking floorboards. The front door seemed impossibly far away, but I made it without them hearing me leave. Outside, I sat in my car for 10 minutes, staring at the house where I'd grown up. The porch light was on, casting the same warm glow it had every night of my childhood. The garden Mom had tended for years looked neat and welcoming in the driveway lamplight. Everything looked normal, safe, like home. But it wasn't home anymore. It was the place where the people I'd trusted most in the world had gathered to celebrate the possibility of my death. I started the engine and drove away without saying goodbye. There was nothing left to say to them, and everything I'd planned to say, about missing them, about staying safe, about coming home soon, now felt hollow and meaningless. They didn't want me to come home. They wanted me to die a hero so they could profit from my heroism. For the first time in my adult life, I hoped I'd never see any of them again. I was 8 years old the first time I realized my parents expected different things from Erica and me. She'd broken Mom's favorite vase playing indoor soccer, and when our parents found the pieces, Erica cried and pointed at me. She made me do it, she sobbed, and somehow I was the one who got grounded. You're older, you should have known better, Dad said, even though I'd been in my room reading when it happened. That pattern followed us through childhood. Erica would skip chores, and I'd be asked to cover for her because family helps family. She'd fail tests because she didn't study, and I'd be expected to tutor her instead of working on my own assignments. When she got caught drinking at a party in high school, my parents grounded me too for not looking out for my little sister. She needs more guidance, Mom would explain when I'd complain about the unfairness. You're naturally responsible. Erica needs our help to get there. I learned early that love in our family was conditional on usefulness. Erica got affection and forgiveness. I got responsibility and expectations. When Erica struggled, it was a problem to be solved. When I struggled, it was a failure to be corrected. By the time I turned 16, I was working afternoons at a local diner to help pay for Erica's dance classes. Not because we couldn't afford them, but because Mom said it would teach me the value of hard work. Erica never had to work. Her job was to focus on her dreams, whatever they were that week. Mine was to make those dreams possible. I applied for every scholarship I could find senior year, not because I couldn't afford college, but because my parents had made it clear that Erica would need help with her tuition when her time came. "You're so smart, you'll find a way," they'd say when I worried about paying for school. "Erica's going to need more support." When I told them I was considering enlisting instead of going to college, their relief was obvious. "That's such a mature decision," Dad said. "Very selfless." What he meant was, one less person to pay for, more resources available for Erica. I enlisted 2 weeks after graduation. Basic training was brutal, but it was the first time in my life that my efforts benefited me directly. When I succeeded, I got promoted. When I worked hard, I got recognition. When I sacrificed, it was for a cause bigger than enabling my sister's irresponsibility. For the first 6 months, I called home twice a week and sent money every month. Erica was starting community college and needed help with expenses. My parents had taken out a second mortgage and were struggling with the payments. There was always someone who needed what I earned. I sent care packages for Erica's birthday, flowers for Mother's Day, and a new tool set for Dad's garage. I wrote letters describing my training, my assignments, the friends I was making. I wanted them to be proud of me, to see that their responsible daughter was making something of herself. Their letters back were brief and focused on problems. Erica was having trouble with her classes. The house needed repairs. Mom's car was making strange noises. Could I send a little extra this month? They'd pay me back when things were better. Things were never better. There was always another crisis, another expense, another reason why the family needed their deployed daughter's income. I didn't mind, not really. It felt good to be useful, to know my service was making their lives easier. During my first leave, I came home to find new furniture in the living room and a remodeled bathroom upstairs. "We've been saving," Mom explained, but the math didn't add up. The amount I'd been sending, combined with what I knew they earned, shouldn't have covered these improvements. "Maybe I don't need to send as much if you're doing well enough to renovate," I suggested. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. "We thought you wanted to help your family," Dad said. "We thought you understood that service means sacrifice." Erica, stretched across the new couch in a designer outfit I'd never seen before, looked up from her phone long enough to add, "Some of us don't get to run away and play soldier when things get tough." I apologized and promised to keep sending money. The last thing I wanted was conflict during my brief time home. I told myself they were right, that supporting family was part of serving something bigger than myself. But lying in my childhood bedroom that night, surrounded by old posters and high school trophies, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been volunteered for a role I'd never auditioned for. The family provider, the responsible one, the daughter whose job was to make everyone else's life possible. Erica had never thanked me for the money I sent. My parents had never acknowledged the sacrifice I was making, the comfort I was giving up so they could have more. They talked about my service like it was a hobby, something I did for my own fulfillment rather than a commitment that kept me away from home and in harm's way. On my second deployment, I started paying attention to how other soldiers talked about their families. They missed their spouses, their children, their parents. But when they talked about going home, their faces lit up. They couldn't wait to see the people they'd been separated from. I realized I felt differently about my leave time. Home had become a place where I was needed, but not necessarily wanted. Where my presence was valuable primarily for what I could provide rather than who I was. Still, they were my family. The only one I had. And families take care of each other, even when the taking care flows mostly in one direction. I had no idea they'd found a way to make my death more valuable than my life. Looking back now, I can see how perfectly they'd set it up. Years of conditioning me to believe my worth was tied to what I could give them. Years of teaching me that questioning their needs was selfish. Years of making me feel guilty for wanting recognition or reciprocation. They'd raised me to be the perfect victim of their betrayal. Someone who loved them too much to protect herself from them. I didn't sleep the night before my deployment. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Erica's laugh and Dad's casual certainty that I'd never leave the service alive. I replayed every conversation from the past few months, every strange question and evasive answer, and saw how carefully they'd been setting this up. The life insurance policy they'd taken out in my name. The forged signatures and falsified medical forms. The way they'd been pumping me for information about my deployment, my assignments, the specific risks I'd be facing. None of it had been concern for my safety. All of it had been research for their investment in my death. $400,000 if I died in combat. Double their money if I died serving my country. No wonder they'd been so supportive of my deployment, so encouraging when I'd volunteered for the more dangerous assignments. I sat on my bunk and tried to process the magnitude of their betrayal. These were people I'd sent money to every month, people I'd called to check on, people I'd worried about and sacrificed for. And they'd been counting down the days until my death could make them rich. The worst part wasn't even the money. It was the casual cruelty, the way they'd laughed about manipulating me. Erica calling me the perfect mark. Dad's confidence that I was too stubborn to ever leave the service alive. Mom's practical questions about investigation procedures. They didn't just hope I'd die. They'd planned for it, prepared for it, made it the foundation of their financial future. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom. "Safe travels today, sweetheart. We love you and we're so proud. Come home to us." The message made me physically sick. Every word was a lie wrapped in false emotion. They weren't proud of me. They loved what I could provide them, not who I was. And they definitely didn't want me to come home. I deleted the message without responding. The flight to base was a blur of logistics and last-minute briefings. I went through the motions of departure protocol, but my mind kept circling back to that conversation in the kitchen. How long had they been planning this? When exactly had they stopped seeing me as a daughter and sister and started seeing me as a financial opportunity? My squad leader noticed I was distracted during the final briefing. "Everything okay at home?" he asked. "Fine," I lied. Just the usual pre-deployment nerves. But nothing was fine. Everything I'd believed about my family, about my place in their lives, had been revealed as fiction. The daughter who sent money home every month was actually funding her own life insurance policy. The sister who called to check in was actually providing intel for her own deathbed. The family member who worried about disappointing them was the subject of their casual murder fantasies. During the long flight overseas, I tried to imagine what would happen when I didn't die as expected. Would they be disappointed? Frustrated that their investment hadn't paid off? Would they find other ways to cash in on my service? I thought about calling them, confronting them with what I'd overheard. But what would be the point? They'd deny it or find ways to justify it. Erica would cry and claim she'd been joking. My parents would act hurt that I'd eavesdropped and misunderstood their intentions. And then they'd go right back to hoping I'd die for their benefit. No, I was done with their lies and manipulations. Done being the responsible daughter who enabled their selfishness. Done sacrificing for people who saw my sacrifice as an investment opportunity. For the first time in my adult life, I was going to focus on keeping myself alive. Not for them, not for some misguided sense of family duty, but for me. Because I deserved to survive this deployment. I deserved to build a life that didn't revolve around funding other people's dreams. I deserved to live. The realization felt like freedom and grief all at once. Freedom from years of guilt and obligation, but grief for the family I'd thought I had. The parents who I'd believed loved me unconditionally. The sister who I'd thought saw me as more than an ATM with legs. They'd never existed. The people who raised me, who I'd been trying to please and support for years, were strangers wearing the faces of family. Strangers who'd smile to my face while hoping for my death. I pulled out my phone and turned it off. No more checking for messages from home. No more guilt about missing their calls. No more wondering if I was doing enough to make them proud. They'd made it clear that the only thing that would make them truly happy was my death. I was going to disappoint them by staying alive. The plane banked toward our destination, carrying me away from the people who'd defined my entire life. For the first time, that distance felt like a gift rather than a sacrifice. I was finally free to find out who I was when I wasn't trying to be the daughter they needed me to be. The person they'd raised me to be would have died for their approval. The person I was becoming was going to live in spite of their betrayal. The first month overseas, I waited for the guilt to kick in. For years, going more than a few days without contacting my family had felt like neglecting a sacred duty. But as days turned to weeks without a single call or message home, I felt lighter instead of burdened. My phone stayed off during downtime. When other soldiers called their families, sharing news and reassurances, I cleaned my weapon or wrote in the journal I'd started keeping. When care packages arrived from home for my squad mates, I didn't feel the familiar pang of disappointment that mine hadn't come. I didn't want anything from the people who were hoping I wouldn't need it. 3 weeks in, Mom started texting frantically. "Haven't heard from you. Are you okay? Please call." Then Dad, "Your mother is worried sick. At least let us know you're alive." Finally, Erica, "Stop being dramatic and call home." The messages revealed exactly what I'd expected. They weren't worried about my well-being out of love. They were worried about their investment. If something happened to me and they weren't listed as my emergency contacts, if I'd somehow discovered the insurance policy and changed the beneficiaries, their financial planning would fall apart. I let the messages pile up unanswered. After a month of silence, the tone shifted from concern to guilt. "We don't understand why you're punishing us. What did we do wrong? Family is supposed to stick together, especially during deployment." The manipulation was so transparent now that I wondered how I'd missed it for years. Every message designed to make me feel guilty for protecting myself from them. Every word calculated to pull me back into the role of dutiful daughter who prioritized their needs over her own safety. Meanwhile, something unexpected was happening. Without the constant drain of family obligations and financial support, I had energy to focus on my actual job. I volunteered for additional training, took on extra responsibilities, started building relationships with people who valued my skills rather than my paycheck. Sergeant Martinez pulled me aside after a particularly successful mission. "You've been different since you got here. More focused. Whatever's working, keep doing it." What was working was the absence of people who wanted me dead. It was remarkable how much mental energy I'd been wasting on family drama, how much emotional bandwidth I'd been dedicating to relationships that were fundamentally toxic. My squad mates became the family I'd never had. People who had my back in life-or-death situations without calculating the financial benefit. People who celebrated my successes without wondering what they could get from me. People who wanted me to come home safe because they genuinely cared about my well-being. During a quiet moment, I told my squad leader about the insurance policy. Not the emotional details, just the basic facts. Someone had taken out a policy on my life without my knowledge or consent, and I was pretty sure it was fraud. "Jesus," he said. "That's messed up. You report it." I shook it off. "I'll handle it when I get back." But the truth was, I wasn't sure I wanted to report it. Let them keep their policy and keep hoping. I was going to disappoint them by staying alive regardless. For months in, the family texts stopped coming. No more guilt trips or demands for contact. I realized they'd probably assumed I was dead and were waiting for official notification. The thought should have hurt, but instead it felt like confirmation that I'd made the right choice. I was thriving without them. My performance reviews were stellar. I'd been recommended for leadership training. My commanding officers talked about me as someone with real potential for advancement. For the first time in my life, my value wasn't measured by what I could provide for other people. When I video called with my squad during a break, I realized I was genuinely happy. Not the fake happiness I'd performed for my family, not the dutiful contentment I'd convinced myself was enough. Real happiness, built on authentic relationships and personal accomplishment. "You look different," Martinez observed. "Older, but in a good way." I was older. I'd aged out of the role of family doormat and into something better. Someone who understood that love shouldn't come with a price tag, that family shouldn't be a one-way financial transaction, that the people who truly care about you don't hope for your death. The deployment that was supposed to be my death sentence became my liberation. Every day I stayed alive was a day I proved them wrong about who I was and what I deserved. Every mission I completed successfully was evidence that I was more than the sum of their expectations. I stopped sending money home. I stopped checking their social media. I stopped wondering if they were proud of me or if I was disappointing them. Their opinions had become irrelevant to my life. Instead, I started planning for my future. What did I want to do after this deployment? Where did I want to live? What kind of relationships did I want to build? For the first time, these questions were about my preferences rather than my obligations. The family that had raised me would never understand the person I was becoming. The daughter they'd trained to sacrifice everything for their benefit was gone, replaced by someone who understood that real love doesn't come with life insurance policies. They'd gambled on my death and lost. I'd gambled on my life and won. The calls started again 6 months into my deployment, but the tone had changed. Instead of guilt trips, I was getting desperation. "We need to talk," from Dad. "There's been a misunderstanding," from Mom. From Erica, "Please just call me back. It's important." I knew what the misunderstanding was. They'd assumed I was dead by now, and my continued silence had them worried that something had gone wrong with their plan. Maybe they'd started checking with military casualty offices. Maybe they'd realized that no news wasn't necessarily bad news from their perspective. I didn't call back. Instead, I did something I should have done years earlier. I started paying attention to my finances. Really paying attention. I called my bank, checked my credit report, reviewed every automatic payment and direct deposit. What I found confirmed my worst suspicions. The monthly transfers to my family had been larger than I remembered authorizing. Small increases over time, additional fees, and emergency payments I'd apparently agreed to but couldn't recall. My credit report showed inquiries I hadn't made, accounts I hadn't opened. Someone had been using my information for more than just life insurance. I spent a week on the phone with various financial institutions, freezing accounts, changing passwords, disputing fraudulent charges. The customer service representatives were sympathetic but not surprised. "Family fraud is more common than people think," one told me, especially with military personnel deployed overseas. The scope of their deception was breathtaking. They hadn't just taken out life insurance on me. They'd been systematically draining my accounts, using my credit, treating my identity like community property. I'd been funding their lifestyle improvements while they prayed for my death to fund their retirement. When I finished cleaning up the financial mess, I felt a rage so pure it surprised me. Not grief anymore, not disappointment. Just clean, focused anger at people who'd spent years stealing from me while I thanked them for the privilege. I changed my emergency contacts, updated my beneficiaries, and designated a military relief fund as the recipient of any death benefits. If something happened to me, the money would go to actual heroes, not to people celebrating my demise. Then I did something that felt both necessary and brutal. I blocked their phone numbers. All of them. No more guilt trips, no more manipulation, no more desperate attempts to reel me back into their dysfunction. They were officially cut off from the daughter they'd tried to kill for profit. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. For the first time since childhood, I felt completely free of their expectations and demands. No more walking on eggshells, no more wondering if I was doing enough to earn their approval. They'd forfeited the right to my consideration when they'd started hoping for my death. My squad noticed the change immediately. "You seem really settled now," Martinez observed. "Like you figured something out." What I'd figured out was the difference between family and people who happen to share your DNA. Family supports you, celebrates you, wants you to thrive. The people who raised me had seen me as a resource to be exploited and eventually cashed in. I started building relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation. I made friends with other soldiers who understood what it meant to serve something bigger than yourself. I found mentors who were invested in my success without expecting anything in return. When I got promoted, I celebrated with my squad instead of calling home to share the news with people who would find ways to make it about themselves. When I earned commendations, I felt proud without wondering if my parents would finally think I was good enough. The person I was becoming had no patience for people who measured love in dollar amounts. No tolerance for relationships built on manipulation and false promises. No willingness to set myself on fire to keep other people warm. 8 months into deployment, I got a message from a number I didn't recognize. "This is Erica. I know you blocked us. We need to talk. Mom is sick." I stared at the text for a full minute before deleting it. Mom being sick was probably another lie designed to manipulate me into contact. Even if it were true, it didn't change anything they'd done. Sick people were still capable of fraud and betrayal. Sick people could still hope their daughters died for money. I didn't respond. They'd lost the right to my concern when they'd started planning my funeral for financial gain. Instead, I focused on the life I was building. The career that was finally about my abilities rather than my willingness to sacrifice for ungrateful people. The relationships based on genuine affection rather than what I could provide. The future that belonged to me instead of people counting on my death. They'd taught me that family was supposed to be unconditional, but they'd made their love conditional on my usefulness and eventually my death. I was learning that real family, chosen family, was people who wanted you alive and thriving, not dead and profitable. The daughter they'd raised was gone. The woman taking her place had no interest in funding anyone's retirement with her corpse. 2 weeks before my deployment ended, I got a message from someone claiming to be a family friend. Your parents asked me to reach out since you won't answer their calls. They're desperate to talk to you. They say there's been a terrible misunderstanding. The misunderstanding was that I was still alive and they couldn't figure out how to collect on their investment. I blocked that number too. I'd been thinking a lot about what would happen when I returned stateside. My family knew my deployment was ending. They probably expected me to come home, to resume sending money and playing the role of dutiful daughter. They'd want explanations for my silence, apologies for worrying them, reassurances that everything would go back to normal. Nothing was going back to normal. Normal had been a lie built on their exploitation of my love for them. I made arrangements to be stationed across the country when my deployment ended. No more living close enough for surprise visits or family emergencies that required my immediate financial intervention. No more being geographically trapped in their dysfunction. My new commanding officer was a woman who'd built her career on merit rather than family connections. During our initial meeting, she asked about my background and goals. When I mentioned that I wanted to focus entirely on my military career, she nodded approvingly. Good. Too many promising soldiers get derailed by family drama. The service needs people who understand that sometimes you have to choose between what your family wants and what you need to become. She had no idea how relevant her words were to my situation. My squad threw me a going-away party that felt more like a homecoming celebration. These people, who I'd known for less than a year, cared more about my well-being than the family who'd raised me. They wanted me to succeed, to stay safe, to build a life I was proud of. Stay in touch, Martinez said as we said goodbye. And don't let anyone convince you that you owe them pieces of yourself. I promised I wouldn't. That version of me was dead, killed by the people who were supposed to protect her. The flight back to the States felt different from the one that had taken me overseas. I wasn't running from anything anymore. I was flying toward a life I'd chosen rather than one that had been chosen for me. At my new base, I threw myself into work with an intensity that impressed my superiors and concerned my peers. But I wasn't working hard to prove anything to anyone else. I was building something that belonged entirely to me, something that couldn't be taken away by people who saw me as a means to an end. Within 6 months, I'd been selected for advanced leadership training. Within a year, I was being considered for positions that would have been unthinkable when I was splitting my focus between military excellence and family obligation. Without the constant drain of supporting people who were actively hoping for my failure, I discovered capabilities I'd never known I possessed. My new life had structure and purpose that felt entirely different from the performance I'd been giving for years. I woke up excited about challenges rather than dreading demands. I went to sleep satisfied with accomplishments rather than worried about whether I'd done enough for people who would never think I'd done enough. The few times I thought about my family, it was with the detached curiosity you might feel about strangers. I wondered if they were still waiting for notification of my death. If they'd figured out that I'd discovered their plan. If they'd found other ways to fund their lifestyle now that I'd cut off their primary source of income. But the wondering never lasted long. I had better things to think about, better people to invest my emotional energy in, better uses for the mental space they'd occupied for so long. One evening, while reviewing reports in my office, I realized I'd gone 3 days without thinking about them at all. The family that had defined my entire identity for decades had become irrelevant to my daily existence. The realization should have been sad, but instead it felt like final confirmation that I'd made the right choice. They'd wanted a daughter who would die for their benefit. Instead, they'd created a woman who learned to live for her own. The irony was perfect. In trying to cash in on my death, they'd given me the motivation to build a life worth living. 3 years after my deployment ended, I got promoted to a position that required a security clearance review. During the background investigation, the agent asked about my family relationships and emergency contacts. "I notice you don't list any family members," she said, reviewing my file. "Is there a particular reason for that?" I'd rehearsed this conversation in my head dozens of times. "We're estranged. They committed financial fraud using my identity while I was deployed." The agent nodded matter-of-factly. "More common than you'd think with military personnel." "Did you file charges?" I hadn't, and I still wasn't sure why. Maybe because proving financial fraud by family members felt like admitting I'd been naive enough to let it happen. Maybe because I'd been so focused on moving forward that prosecuting them felt like looking backward. Maybe because cutting them off completely had felt like justice enough. I handled it privately, I told the agent, which was true enough. "Well, you've clearly rebuilt well," she said, closing my file. "Your references speak very highly of your character and reliability." My references. People who'd known me for 3 years versus people who'd known me my entire life, but who understood my worth better than the family who'd raised me. People who saw my potential instead of my utility. People who wanted me to succeed because they respected me, not because my success made their lives easier. After the review, I walked across space thinking about how completely my life had changed. The daughter who'd sent money home every month and called twice a week had been replaced by someone whose value wasn't measured in what she could provide for other people. I had a career built on merit rather than obligation. Relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial dependence. Goals that were about my aspirations rather than other people's needs. That night, I did something I'd been avoiding for years. I looked at my family on social media. Just curiosity, I told myself. Just to see how they were managing without their primary source of income. What I found was exactly what I'd expected. Dad had taken a part-time job at a hardware store. Mom was working at a local bank. Erica had moved back in with them, her social media posts full of complaints about money and adult responsibilities. The house I'd grown up in looked shabby in recent photos, the improvements they'd made with my money showing signs of neglect now that they couldn't afford maintenance. Erica's designer outfits had been replaced with bargain store clothing. The lifestyle I'd funded had collapsed without my support. I felt nothing looking at the pictures. No satisfaction at their obvious financial struggles, no guilt about my role in their reduced circumstances. Just the mild interest you might feel reading about strangers' problems in the newspaper. They'd chosen to see me as a resource rather than a daughter. When the resource was removed, they'd been forced to face the reality of their actual financial situation. It wasn't my fault they'd built their comfort on exploiting someone who loved them. I closed the browser and went back to reviewing applications for the leadership program I'd been asked to help coordinate. Real work, meaningful work, work that mattered to people who mattered to me. The next morning, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Is this really you?" Erica's voice, older and smaller than I remembered. "I can't believe you answered." I should have hung up immediately. Instead, I found myself curious about what she'd say after 3 years of silence. "I know you hate us," she continued when I didn't respond. "I know we messed up. But Mom really is sick this time, and she wants to see you before she dies, and you can't collect on the insurance policy?" The words came out colder than I'd intended, but they felt true. Erica was quiet for a long moment. "You know about that?" "I know about all of it. The forged signatures, the fraudulent accounts, the systematic theft of my identity and income. I know about the party you threw to celebrate your investment in my death." "It wasn't like that," Erica said, but her voice lacked conviction. We were scared about money, and you seemed so successful, and you thought I was too stupid and too devoted to notice you were stealing from me while hoping I'd die." I kept my voice level, professional. "You thought wrong. We made a mistake," Erica said. "A huge mistake. But you're still our family." "No," I said quietly. "I'm not. Family doesn't take out life insurance policies on each other without consent. Family doesn't steal identities and drain bank accounts. Family doesn't celebrate the possibility of a daughter's death. We were desperate. You were greedy. And you were stupid enough to think I'd never find out." Erica started crying, which had always been her go-to strategy when she wanted something. Please. Mom is really sick. She has maybe 6 months, and she just wants to see you one more time. I thought about hanging up, but something made me ask, what kind of sick? Cancer. Pancreatic. They caught it too late. If it was true, Mom was dying. If it was another manipulation, Erica was using a fake terminal diagnosis to try to guilt me into contact. Either way, my response was the same. I'm sorry she's sick, I said, and I meant it. But that doesn't change what you did to me. That doesn't make me responsible for fixing your family drama or funding your emotional needs. She's your mother. She's someone who hoped I would die in combat so she could collect $400,000. That's not motherhood. That's investment strategy. Erica was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. We know we can't undo what we did. We know we don't deserve forgiveness. But she's dying and she loves you. She loved what I could provide. She loved the money I sent and the insurance policy she took out. She never loved me enough to want me alive. That's not true. It is true. I heard you laughing about it. I heard Dad say I was too stubborn to leave the service alive and that at least it wouldn't be for nothing. I heard you call me the perfect mark. The silence stretched between us, filled with years of hurt and betrayal and the knowledge that some things couldn't be forgiven or forgotten. I have to go, I finally said. Wait, Erica said desperately. What if we paid you back? What if we found a way to make this right? There is no making this right. You can't unhope for someone's death. You can't uncelebrate their potential murder. You can't unsteal their identity and financial security. Then what do you want from us? Nothing, I said, and realized I meant it completely. I want absolutely nothing from any of you. I want you to live your lives and leave me alone to live mine. But we're family. No, I said one final time. We're not. I hung up and blocked the number immediately. Then I sat at my desk for a few minutes, waiting to feel something. Guilt, sadness, regret. Instead, I felt the same sense of completion I got after finishing a difficult mission. Something that had needed to be done was finally done. I had a meeting to get to, subordinates who depended on my leadership, and a career that was built on my abilities rather than anyone else's needs. I had chosen family who wanted me alive and thriving, not dead and profitable. The people who had raised me were strangers now, defined entirely by their decision to see me as a resource rather than a daughter. I'd given them 20+ years of my life, my money, and my unconditional love. They'd responded by taking out a life insurance policy and hoping I'd die for their benefit. The daughter they'd raised might have forgiven them, might have found ways to excuse their behavior, might have gone home to play the role they expected one final time. The woman I'd become understood that some betrayals were unforgivable and some relationships weren't worth saving. I walked to my meeting, leaving the past behind me where it belonged. 5 years later, I stood in formation as my commanding officer pinned Lieutenant Colonel Eagles on my collar. The ceremony was held on a crisp October morning, the kind of day that made military dress uniforms look exactly as impressive as they were designed to look. My chosen family was there in the audience. Martinez, now a sergeant major, had flown in specifically for the promotion ceremony. My mentor, Colonel Peterson, sat in the front row with the pride of someone who'd watched a protege exceed every expectation. My unit, soldiers I'd trained and led through 2 more deployments, stood at attention with the kind of discipline that reflected well on everyone involved. Not a single member of my biological family was present, and their absence didn't create even a moment of sadness or regret. They'd forfeited the right to celebrate my achievements when they decided my death was more valuable than my life. The base commander spoke about leadership, service, and the kind of character that earned rapid advancement in the military. He mentioned my performance evaluations, my ability to inspire subordinates, and my commitment to excellence that had become legendary among officers who'd worked with me. Lieutenant Colonel Williams represents the best of what military service can produce, he said. Someone who understands that true leadership means putting mission and people before personal comfort, who has consistently demonstrated the kind of integrity that builds unshakable trust. If only he knew that my integrity had been forged in the fire of ultimate family betrayal. That my commitment to putting others first had been learned by experiencing what happened when the people closest to you put themselves first in the most devastating way possible. After the ceremony, I hosted a small reception for the people who'd supported my journey. Real people who'd celebrated my successes without calculating what they could get from them. People who'd had my back in combat zones and career decisions alike. You know what I'm proudest of? Martinez said during his toast. You figured out early that family isn't about DNA. It's about who shows up when it matters. The people in that room had shown up. Through deployments and training exercises, through late-night strategy sessions and early morning PT, through the hundreds of small moments that built real relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection. Meanwhile, somewhere 3,000 miles away, the people who'd raised me were probably wondering why they'd never been contacted about my promotion. Maybe they'd seen it in some local military newsletter or social media post. Maybe they'd felt a twinge of regret that they weren't part of this moment. I hoped they did. I hoped they understood exactly what they'd lost when they'd decided to value my death over my life. That evening, I sat in my office reviewing the files of soldiers I'd now be responsible for leading. Young men and women who'd joined the service for all kinds of reasons, who came from families that ran the gamut from incredibly supportive to deeply dysfunctional. Some of them reminded me of who I'd been at their age, eager to prove themselves, desperate for approval from people who might not deserve it, willing to sacrifice anything for family who might not be willing to sacrifice anything for them. I made a mental note to watch for signs of family exploitation among my troops, to create space for conversations about boundaries and self-respect, to model the kind of leadership that valued people for who they were rather than what they could provide. The military had given me more than a career. It had given me a framework for understanding honor, loyalty, and integrity that had nothing to do with biological relationships. It had taught me that the most profound bonds were forged through shared commitment to something bigger than individual comfort. My biological family had shared DNA with me, but they'd never shared my values. They'd claimed to love me while systematically exploiting that love. They'd talked about family loyalty while demonstrating the most fundamental disloyalty possible, hoping for my death for their financial benefit. The family I'd chosen understood that love wasn't measured in dollar amounts. That loyalty meant wanting the best for someone even when it didn't benefit you personally. That integrity meant keeping faith with people who'd trusted you, especially when they couldn't monitor your behavior. These were military values, but they were also basic human values. The values my biological family had failed to demonstrate when it mattered most. I locked my office and walked across base toward my quarters. The evening was peaceful, the kind of moment that reminded me why I'd chosen this life. Clear purpose, honest relationships, work that mattered to people who mattered to me. Tomorrow, I'd start learning the responsibilities of my new rank, figuring out how to be the kind of leader my soldiers deserved. I'd continue building a life based on merit rather than obligation, surrounded by people who celebrated my successes rather than calculating their benefit from my failures. The daughter who'd once believed family meant unconditional financial support was gone, replaced by someone who understood that real family meant unconditional emotional support. Someone who'd learned the difference between people who loved you and people who loved what you could do for them. I'd survived more than deployments and combat zones. I'd survived the betrayal of people who were supposed to protect me, and I'd built something better from the ruins of their deception. Some nights I still wondered if they thought about what they'd lost. If they understood that their greed had cost them not just my financial support, but any claim to my life, my achievements, my future. But wondering never lasted long. I had better things to think about, better people to invest in, better uses for the energy they'd consumed for so many years. They'd gambled everything on my death and lost completely. I'd gambled everything on my life and won more than I'd ever imagined possible. The best revenge wasn't confrontation or retaliation. It was building a life so successful, so fulfilling, so completely independent of their influence that their betrayal became irrelevant to my daily existence. I'd become someone they could never manipulate, never exploit, never convince to sacrifice my well-being for their benefit. Someone who understood that survival itself could be the most powerful form of victory. They'd hoped I wouldn't come home from deployment. Instead, I'd come home to a life that had nothing to do with them, surrounded by people who wanted me alive and thriving. In the end, that was the only family that mattered. The one that celebrated my survival rather than investing in my death. The stars were bright over base housing as I reached my door, each one a reminder that there were bigger things than family drama, more important things than biological obligations, better ways to spend a life than funding other people's dreams at the expense of your own. I was exactly where I was supposed to be, exactly who I was supposed to be, surrounded by exactly the people I was supposed to be with. And none of them had ever hoped I would die for their benefit. That was enough. That was everything. 7 years after that night in my parents' kitchen, I received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping about my promotion to full colonel, along with a handwritten note on familiar stationery. "We saw this in the Veterans newsletter. We always knew you'd do great things. We're proud of you. Love, Mom." I stared at the note for a long moment, trying to decode the audacity. They'd seen my promotion announcement and somehow convinced themselves they had a right to pride in my accomplishments. The same people who'd hoped I'd die in combat so they could collect insurance money were now claiming credit for the success I'd built in spite of their betrayal. I dropped the note in my office shredder without a second thought. Their pride was worth exactly as much as their love had been, nothing that couldn't be withdrawn the moment it became inconvenient. That afternoon, I was reviewing personnel files when my aide knocked on my door. "Ma'am, there's someone here to see you. Says she's your sister." My blood went cold. "Tell her I'm not available. She says it's about your mother's funeral. That you'd want to know." I sat back in my chair, processing the information. Mom had died, presumably from the cancer Erica had mentioned years earlier. And Erica had driven across the country to deliver the news in person, probably hoping physical proximity would accomplish what phone calls couldn't. "Tell her she has 5 minutes," I said finally. Erica looked older when she walked into my office, worn down in ways that went beyond normal aging. The designer clothes were long gone, replaced by discount store basics that had seen better days. Her face carried the kind of exhaustion that came from years of financial stress and emotional consequences. "Thank you for seeing me," she said, sitting across from my desk like a subordinate reporting to a superior officer. "You said something about a funeral. Mom died last week. Pancreatic cancer, like I told you." Erica's voice was steady, but I could see her hands shaking slightly. "The service is Thursday. We thought you should know. Now I know." I went back to reviewing files, making it clear the conversation was over. "That's it?" Erica's composure cracked slightly. "She was your mother. She was someone who took out life insurance on me and hoped I'd die in combat for her financial benefit. That's not motherhood." She regretted that every day. I looked up from my files, meeting Erica's eyes directly. "Did she cancel the policy?" Erica's silence was answer enough. She regretted getting caught, not doing it. "There's a difference. She loved you. She loved my money. She loved the idea of $400,000 more than she loved the idea of me coming home alive." I closed the file I'd been reading. "Your 5 minutes are up. Please." Erica's voice broke completely now. "I know we destroyed everything. I know we don't deserve forgiveness. But she's dead, and Dad is falling apart, and I don't know how to handle any of this. None of that is my problem to solve. We're family. We've had this conversation. We're not family. Family doesn't hope for each other's death. Family doesn't commit fraud against each other. Family doesn't steal identities and drain bank accounts." Erica wiped her eyes with a tissue that had seen better days. "What if I told you everything? What if I explained exactly how it happened, how we justified it to ourselves?" "I don't care how you justified it. I heard you laughing about my death. I heard Dad say I was too stubborn to survive. I heard you call me the perfect mark." The words came out harder than I'd intended. "No explanation changes what you were willing to do to me. We were scared about money. So you decided to solve your money problems by hoping I'd be killed in action. That's not fear. That's sociopathy." Erica flinched like I'd slapped her. "We made a mistake. You made a choice. Multiple choices over months or years. You chose to forge my signature. You chose to take out that policy. You chose to steal my identity. You chose to hope for my death." I stood up, making it clear she needed to leave. You chose everything that happened, and now you get to live with the consequences. The consequences are that mom died estranged from her daughter. That dad drinks himself to sleep every night. That I work 3 jobs just to keep the house. Erica's voice was raw with exhaustion. We lost everything when you cut us off. You lost the money you were stealing from me. That's not everything. That's just the theft you'd gotten used to. We depended on your help. You depended on exploiting someone who loved you. When the exploitation ended, you had to face reality. I walked to my office door and opened it. Reality is that actions have consequences, and yours caught up with you. Erica stood slowly, looking around my office like she was trying to memorize it. The awards on the walls, the photos with my chosen family, the evidence of a life built on merit rather than manipulation. You really hate us, don't you? I don't feel anything about you. That's the point. She nodded like she finally understood. The funeral is Thursday at 2. First Baptist on Maple Street. In case you change your mind. I won't. Erica walked to the door, then turned back one final time. For what it's worth, she really did love you. In her own way. Her way involved hoping I'd die for money. That's not love in any definition that matters. After Erica left, I sat at my desk trying to process the conversation. Mom was dead, and I felt nothing. No grief, no regret, no sense of unfinished business. The woman who'd raised me had died a stranger, someone whose choices had made love impossible and reconciliation pointless. I thought about the funeral I wouldn't attend, the family drama I wouldn't participate in, the guilt trips that would no longer reach me. Somewhere, Dad was probably drinking and Erica was probably struggling with arrangements they couldn't afford. Their financial problems would get worse without Mom's income. Their family unit, already fractured by my absence, would probably collapse entirely under the weight of grief and money stress. None of it was my responsibility. I'd learned the hard way that some people would take everything you offered and still want more. That some relationships were built on exploitation rather than affection. That family titles meant nothing without family behavior to back them up. The woman who died had made her choice years ago when she decided my death was more valuable than my life. She'd lived with that choice, and now she died with it. I had work to do, soldiers to lead, a life to live that had nothing to do with people who'd seen me as an investment rather than a daughter. The family I'd chosen was waiting for me at the officers' club, where we had dinner plans to celebrate another colleague's promotion. Real family. People who celebrated each other's lives rather than calculating profit from each other's deaths. I locked my office and walked toward the people who actually mattered, leaving the past behind me where it belonged. If this hit close to home, you're not alone. Drop a comment. Have you ever discovered a hidden policy, style betrayal, or a secret that changed how you see family? Did you confront, set boundaries, or go no contact, and what happened next? What's one red flag you wish you hadn't ignored? If this helped, tap like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs stronger boundaries. Want the next chapter of this story? Tell me what you'd do if you overheard that conversation the night before deployment.